Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America. This daily show goes year by year through all 250 years of American history, telling a linear story of our country. If you are returning, welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome aboard. Now let's get into the episode. Threats continue for American merchants at sea. John Adams endorses a policy that proves to be amongst the most controversial of his administration, and a new amendment is on the horizon for the United States. Welcome to 1798 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and Congress receives a message from President Adams in which he says he'll be aiding them in ascertaining the status of the proposed amendment to the Constitution, regarding, as Adams puts it, the suability of the states. As we mentioned back in 1793, the Supreme Court found that the state of Georgia was not immune to being sued by a citizen of South Carolina, and the precedent that decision created was an alarming one to state leaders and legislatures who fear a rise in litigation and erosion of their power. It's found that the necessary 3/4 of the states have ratified this new amendment, and on January 8th, the 11th Amendment is adopted and officially added to the Constitution. This is the first time the Constitution was amended in nearly a decade, and it's the first one to not be part of the original Bill of Rights. It reads, "The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity, commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state, or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state." The concept of this amendment is commonly referred to as sovereign immunity, and it's interesting to note that the ruling in the underlying case, though decided in favor of the plaintiff by the Supreme Court in a 4-1 ruling, is never upheld, the amendment de facto overturning the case's verdict. It's now the 22nd of January, and we must stop and remember the life of Lewis Morris. Morris was born in the Westchester County of New York, which is now the Bronx, in 1726. Morris was tutored at home and then entered Yale at age 16, from which he graduated in 46. He married Mary Walton in 49, and together they had 6 sons and 4 daughters. He was elected to the Colonial Assembly of New York around 69 and as a delegate to the Provincial Assembly in April of 75. Although he lived in a pro-loyalist area with neighbors holding strong views of affection, warmth, and loyalty to the king, Morris became increasingly critical of British policy. Morris took his seat in Philadelphia in 75 after being elected to the Second Continental Congress, and before the signing in 76, he was placed on a committee, with George Washington as chair, to address the problems of supplying military stores, arms, and ammunition to the army. Morris was sent to the Western country to assist with inducing the Indians to either make common cause with the colonists or at least remain neutral, and he remained at Pittsburgh through the winter, returning to his seat in the Continental Congress by early March of 76. In his role as a representative for New York, Morris couldn't take any action on the resolution for independence until the 9th of July, when New York finally approved the resolution. And on the 11th, Morris joined his fellow representatives in making the declaration a unanimous action, going on to sign it in August. Morris left the Continental Congress in 77, focused on local affairs, and being elected to serve as a senator in New York from 77 to 81, and again from 84 to 88. Morris also served in the Westchester County Militia, rising to the rank of Major General. Now, approaching his 72nd year, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, Lewis Morris dies on the 22nd of January and is interred in a vault beneath St. Anne's Church. As is mentioned on his gravestone, Lewis Morris bears the distinction of being the only signer from New York City. On February 2nd, the Federal Street Theater in Boston burns to the ground just 5 years after first opening its doors, when a porter leaves some wood under a lit stove. Remarkably, though, by the year's end, the theater will once again be open for business, a triumph recorded in a watercolor from this same year. While we're on the topic of theater in America, I'd like to take a moment and address an interesting piece of our history I only found in researching this show. Theater performances are largely considered immoral amongst Puritan and Quaker communities, and the moral stance influenced several state laws. Theater performances were illegal in Massachusetts until '93, when construction was initially completed for this theater, and technically remains illegal in Pennsylvania as of '98, though this statute is not enforced and culturally ignored. Mid-February brings an interesting story of conflict in Congress, though unlike most, this is a physical one. Matthew Lyons of Vermont reportedly spits his tobacco juice at Roger Griswold of Connecticut, and as Lyons is not expelled for the gross indecency, Griswold seeks his own justice and attacks the representative with a cane, while Lyons defends himself with a pair of tongs. There's a relatively famous and quite amusing etching of the brawl on our X, and it's definitely worth a look. Across the United States, rumors swirl in the press about the failure of the diplomatic mission in France. Federalists accuse the French of dishonor, while Democratic Republicans suspect Adams of warmongering and capitalizing on the event to consolidate power. The commissioner's dispatches explaining the situation, most of which are in code, arrive in Philadelphia on March 4th, and Adams sends the decoded dispatch from January to Congress the next day. On March 19th, he sends another message reporting the failure of the mission to Congress and calling for defense measures. In the message, he declares that all French ports are closed to neutral shipping and that any ship carrying English goods is subject to French capture. However, even as more comprehensive reports on the French demands are deciphered, Adams decides not to reveal the details to Congress, believing them to be too inflammatory. Assuming that he is withholding information favorable to France to create a cause for war, on April 2nd, the House passes a resolution requesting that Adams release the full dispatches related to the diplomatic mission, and he complies the very next day, sending a full report of the affair to Congress, though he redacts the names, replacing them with the now famous placeholders W, X, Y, and Z. W, or Nicholas Hubbard, only served to introduce the diplomats, and so the failed mission becomes known to history as the XYZ affair. The news of the behavior of the French agents infuriates Congress, and once communicated to the public, the nation is stunned by the report as well. Demands for war begin echoing from every corner of the Federalist press, and the phrase, "millions for defense but not 1 cent for tribute," becomes a rallying cry. Funds are appropriated quickly to build new warships. A provisional army is authorized, and knowing no other general as successful, George Washington is summoned from retirement to oversee the army should war break out. We will, of course, continue telling this story of the XYZ affair, but first let's head south, where on April 7th, the Mississippi Territory is organized from territory ceded by Georgia and South Carolina and is officially opened to settlement. A few settlers already live in this territory concentrated in 2 principal areas. Approximately 4,500 people, including enslaved people, live at Natchez, and around 1,250 live in the Tombigbee settlements. Outside of these two areas, the territory is populated by the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations. More farming families and individuals eagerly head to these untamed lands, chasing a chance to build their livelihoods up from nothing other than the rich soil. And as the lands are cheaper than in the East, these territories give even struggling families a chance to create a prosperous life. Heading back to one of today's main stories, on April 30th, Congress establishes the Department of the Navy in order to meet the need for an executive department responsible solely for, and staffed with, persons expert in naval affairs, with the primary threat France is posing being one of maritime clashes, not ground invasions. Secretary of War James McHenry requisitions armament supplies to be delivered to the USS Constitution, which just recently has been completed, and the ship is outfitted with 12, 18, and 24-pound cannons. Samuel Nicholson, the ship's captain, alerts the Navy that he's having difficulty finding a crew despite his officers actively recruiting throughout May. And on May 12th, the following notice appears in the Columbian Sentinel. To all able-bodied and patriotic seamen who are willing to serve their country and support its cause, the President of the United States, having ordered the captain and commander of the good frigate Constitution of 44 guns, now riding in the harbor of Boston, to employ the most vigorous exertions to put said ship, as speedily as possible, in a situation to sail at the shortest command. Notice is hereby given that a house of rendezvous is opened at the sign of the Federal Eagle, kept by Mrs. Broaders. In 50 able seamen and 95 ordinary seamen will have an opportunity of entering into the service of their country for 1 year unless sooner discharged by the President of the United States. To all able-bodied seamen, the sum of $17, and to all ordinary seamen, the sum of $10 per month will be given, and 2 months' advance will be paid by the recruiting officer if necessary. None will be allowed to enter this honorable service but such as are well organized, healthy, and robust, and free from scorbutic and consumptive affections. A glorious opportunity now presents to the brave and hardy seamen of New England to enter the service of their country, to avenge its wrongs, and to protect its rights on the ocean. Those brave lads are now invited to repair to the flag of the Constitution now lying at the above rendezvous, where they will be kindly received, handsomely entertained, and may enter into immediate pay. By June, Nicholson sets sails on the Constitution for the first time, but only to move the ship as far as the outer Boston harbor near Castle Island in an effort to discourage the crew from deserting. And as more men join the ship and supplies are continuing to be brought aboard, the ship is soon ready for its first real voyage, heading to the Caribbean, where the ship is tasked with protecting American merchant vessels from French privateers. As part of further preparations for war, the federal government begins looking to increase their production of firearms. A man we've mentioned before in the context of his invention and subsequent patenting of the cotton gin, Eli Whitney, sees an opportunity to save himself from the bankruptcy that he's currently on the cusp of. And as technological advancements are going to be an increasing part of this show, let's look into how Whitney changes the game in firearms production. He moves to apply his idea of using identical parts to make guns and speed up the manufacturing process. Currently, muskets are made by craftsmen who assemble guns individually and with custom-fit parts, which makes producing large numbers quickly infeasible without a massive number of men working simultaneously. On June 14th, he secures a contract to produce 10,000 muskets to be delivered within 28 months at the total cost of $134,000. To break that down a little, this means that he'll have to produce about a dozen guns a day and that for each gun he'll be paid $13.40. He first visits the Springfield Armory and notes that the water supply is quite a distance from the factory. And as he's looking to use water to power his operations, he buys a grist mill on the Mill River outside of New Haven, Connecticut. And there, he spends most of his 28 months building jigs and creating machinery to standardize the production of the weapons he's been contracted to build. He develops the filing jig, which guides the workers' files, and designs stencils with up to a dozen holes that help to bore in exact places, repeatedly and precisely. Whitney fixes mechanical stops to his lathes, which prevent the workers from turning the piece too far or not far enough, and fashions dies and molds for various parts to speed up production. At first, he looks to hire experienced craftsmen to work in his factory, but he soon finds that his tools have made the task approachable enough that it's actually easier to train unskilled men to make the parts, and he assigns the production of individual parts to specific workers who are able to churn out identical pieces to later be assembled. His endeavor, however pioneering it may be, turns out to be more than he can handle, and he's plagued with delays, so we'll catch back up with Whitley later when he finally delivers the 10,000 guns he's signed on to produce. Elsewhere, naval conflict begins in the Caribbean as American vessels begin to intercept French corsairs, looking to discourage their targeting of American merchant ships. Let me pause briefly to point out that during this entire time, war is never declared between the United States and France. The Constitution's first article empowers Congress, the sole authority to declare war, but formal declarations carry some serious diplomatic repercussions. The President serves as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and, as such, has the power to initiate military action separate from the formal declaration of war to respond to attacks and defend the nation. It's because of this lack of a formal declaration of war that this conflict with France is remembered as the quasi-war or near war. By the end of June and into July, Congress passes a series of laws in response to the French threat, including 4 known collectively as the Alien and Sedition Acts. Unavoidably, there is much discourse on the topic in our present year, and again, it is my job here to spectate, not commentate. So, we'll simply read from archives.gov on the substance of these acts, instead of attempting to summarize them as I normally would. On June 18th, there is an amendment passed to the current naturalization rules which we covered and read in our 1790 episode, and the amendment increases the residency requirement for U.S. citizenship from 5 to 14 years and extends the required period for declaring an intent to become a citizen from 3 to 5 years. On the 25th, there is the Alien Act, which states, quote, that it shall be lawful for the President of the United States at any time during the continuance of this act to order all such aliens as he shall judge dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States, or shall have reasonable grounds to suspect are concerned in any treasonable or secret machinations against the government thereof, to depart out of the territory of the United States, within such time as shall be expressed in such order, which order shall be served on such alien by delivering him a copy thereof, or leaving the same at his usual abode, and returned to the office of the Secretary of State, by the marshal or other person to whom the same shall be directed. And in case any alien so ordered to depart shall be found at large within the United States after the time limited in such order for his departure, and not having obtained a license from the President to reside therein, or having obtained such license shall not have conformed thereto, every such alien shall, on conviction thereof, be imprisoned for a term not exceeding 3 years, and shall never after be admitted to become a citizen of the United States. This act shall continue and be in force for and during the term of 2 years from the passing thereof. On July 6th, Congress approves an act respecting alien enemies, which reads, quote, "Whenever there shall be a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government, or any invasion or predatory incursion shall be perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States by any foreign nation or government, and the President of the United States shall make public proclamation of the event, all natives, citizens, denizens, or subjects of the hostile nation or government, being males of the age of 14 years and upwards, who shall be within the United States and not actually naturalized, shall be liable to be apprehended, restrained, secured, and removed as alien enemies. And the President of the United States shall be, and he is hereby authorized, in any event as aforesaid by his proclamation thereof or other public act, to direct the conduct to be observed on the part of the United States towards the aliens who shall become liable as aforesaid, the manner and degree of the restraint to which they shall be subject, and in what cases and upon what security their residence shall be permitted, and to provide for the removal of those who, not being permitted to reside within the United States, shall refuse or neglect to depart therefrom, and to establish any other regulations which shall be found necessary in the premises and for the public safety. This act, unlike others amongst the Alien and Sedition Acts, has no sunset clause, and though it has been amended, it remains in force as of the time of recording. In what is really no small move, on July 7th, Congress annuls the Treaty of Alliance with France from 1778, and on July 9th, Congress approves an act further to protect the commerce of the United States, which reads, quote, "The President of the United States shall be, and he is hereby authorized to instruct the commanders of the public armed vessels which are, or which shall be employed in the service of the United States, to subdue, seize, and take any armed French vessel which shall be found within the jurisdictional limits of the United States or elsewhere on the high seas, and such captured vessel with her apparel, guns, and appurtenances, and the goods or effects which shall be found on board the same, being French property, shall be brought within some port of the United States, and shall be duly proceeded against and condemned as forfeited, and shall accrue and be distributed, as by law is or shall be provided respecting the captures which shall be made by the public armed vessels of the United States." On July 11th, the U.S. Marine Corps is officially established, or more accurately, reestablished after the dissolution of the Continental Marines in '83 after the Revolution. The next day, President Adams appoints William Ward Burroughs as the first Major Commandant of the newly reestablished Marine Corps. Finally, on the 14th, Congress approves an act in addition to the act entitled "An Act for the Punishment of Certain Crimes Against the United States," which reads, quote, "If any persons shall unlawfully combine or conspire together with intent to oppose any measure or measures of the government of the United States which are or shall be directed by proper authority, or to impede the operation of any law of the United States, or to intimidate or prevent any person holding a place or office in or under the government of the United States from undertaking, performing, or executing his trust or duty, and if any person or persons with intent as aforesaid shall counsel, advise, or attempt to procure any insurrection, riot, unlawful assembly, or combination, whether such conspiracy, threatening, counsel, advice, or attempt shall have the proposed effect or not, he or they shall be deemed guilty of a high misdemeanor, and on conviction, before any court of the United States having jurisdiction thereof, shall be punished by a fine not exceeding $5,000, and by imprisonment during a term not less than 6 months, nor exceeding 5 years. And further, at the discretion of the court may be holden to find sureties for his good behavior in such sum, and for such time, as the said court may direct. And be it further enacted, that if any person shall write, print, utter, or publish, or shall cause or procure to be written, printed, uttered, or published, or shall knowingly and willingly assist or aid in writing, printing, uttering, or publishing any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States, or either House of the Congress of the United States, or the President of the United States, with intent to defame the said government, or either House of the said Congress, or the said President, or to bring them or either of them into contempt or disrepute, or to excite against them, or either or any of them, the hatred of the good people of the United States, or to stir up sedition within the United States, or to excite any unlawful combinations therein, for opposing or resisting any law of the United States, or any act of the President of the United States, done in pursuance of any such law, or of the powers in him vested by the Constitution of the United States, or to resist, oppose, or defeat any such law or act, or to aid, encourage, or abet any hostile designs of any foreign nation against United States, their people, or government, then such person being thereof convicted before any court of the United States having jurisdiction thereof, shall be punished by a fine not exceeding $2,000, and by imprisonment not exceeding 2 years. This act shall continue and be in force until the 3rd day of March 1801 and no longer, provided that the expiration of the act shall not prevent or defeat a prosecution and punishment of any offense against the law during the time it shall be in force. This wide-reaching law proves to be the most controversial, and it's interesting to note that the Sunset Clause puts the expiration of this act at March 3rd of 1801, the day before the next presidential inauguration will be taking place. As we will come to see, this Sedition Act proves to be highly unpopular, especially amongst the Democratic Republicans, who feel they are silenced through the enforcement of this law. The question now for the U.S. government is how to pay for the war preparations. After a long and often contentious debate, Congress imposes a new federal property tax levied on both real estate and slave ownership, with a goal of generating $2 million. This is America's first property tax since '76, and having already covered Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, both violent actions taken by masses in response to taxation and tax enforcement, we'll begin to look into how the people respond to this tax next year. It can be argued that one of the most lasting effects of the XYZ affair and the quasi-war with France is the sharp polarization of American politics when it comes to the perception of federal power. Of course, these splits have existed even before the drafting of the Constitution, but Federalists point to the French insult as proof that Republican ideals have gone too far, while Republicans insist Adams is using the crisis to justify the expansion of executive power, pointing to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which, it's worth noting, Adams did not propose, though he did sign. We'll further address this fallout at the end of today's episode, but for now, we'll remember the other two signers of the Declaration to pass away this year. James Wilson was born in 1742 in Scotland. one of only 8 signers born abroad. At the age of 15, James earned a scholarship and later a degree from St. Andrews before going on to study at the universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. In 65, Wilson embarked on his journey across the Atlantic, arriving in New York during the controversy known as the Stamp Tax, which spurred him on to study the legal relationship between the British Parliament and the colonies, and the British King and the colonies. He titles this study The Considerations on the Nature and Effect of the Legislative Authority of the British Parliament. Even though Wilson began his study with the assumption that the Acts of Parliament had at least some binding effect on the colonies, he was amazed to discover that none existed on any basis. He did conclude, however, that the colonists, as subjects of the king, owed loyalty and allegiance to the crown, equal with the subjects in England, and were entitled to the same rights and privileges. His conclusion strongly supported the approach later taken in the Declaration of Independence in charging the king with injurious conduct. In 74, Wilson published his considerations and had it distributed to all the members of the First Continental Congress. Wilson's language adopting the doctrine of popular sovereignty is similar to that found in the Declaration. For instance, he wrote, "All men are, by nature, equal and free. No one has a right to any authority over another without his consent. All lawful government is founded on the consent of those who are subject to it. Such consent was given with a view to endure and to increase the happiness of the governed, above what they could enjoy in an independent and unconnected state of nature. The consequence is that the happiness of the society is the first law of every government." His star rising, in May of 75, Wilson joined the Continental Congress for Pennsylvania, and a year later, after the 2-day debate over Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence, 7 colonies were in favor of independence, but 5, including Pennsylvania, were against it. On July 2nd, when the time came to vote, Wilson, Franklin, and Morton prevailed in a 3-2 vote. The 2 Pennsylvania delegates who were not in favor of independence at the time elected not to attend Congress that day, so that Pennsylvania could join with the other colonies and make the vote unanimous. As we covered in our 79 episode, Wilson was the target of violence when the public learned of his providing legal defense for loyalists, and his home in Philadelphia was attacked in what is now remembered as the attack on Fort Wilson. In 87, when the states called for a constitutional convention to amend and update the Articles, Wilson made arguably his most important contribution as a founding father by framing the new federal constitution. He was considered by many of those present the best-read lawyer at the convention. After 2 months of deliberation, the delegates formed a 5-person committee called the Committee of Detail to draft a written form of the Constitution, and James Wilson was delegated by the committee to write it. Governor Morris wrote the final version of the Constitution, which closely followed the form and content of Wilson's draft, including the immortal beginning, "We the People." Earlier this year, while on federal court business, Wilson arrived at Edenton, North Carolina, in what I've seen described as a state of acute mental distress. He was taken into the home of James Iredell, a fellow justice of the Supreme Court, but within months he dies on August 21st and is buried nearby at Hayes Plantation. Amongst a list of his accomplishments, Wilson's grave is inscribed with one of his more famous quotes, "That the supreme power, therefore, should be vested in the people, is in my judgment the great panacea of human politics." James Wilson is the 33rd signer to pass away, but within weeks, there's a 34th. George Reed was born in 1733 on a family estate in Cecil County, Maryland, and he studied law and was called to the bar at age 19 in Philadelphia, eventually moving to Newcastle, Delaware in 54. Having been appointed Attorney General under the Crown at the early age of 29, Mr. Reed felt it to be his duty to warn the British government of the danger of attempting to tax the colonies without giving them direct representation in Parliament. And in his correspondence with his friend Sir Richard Neave, he said that a continuance in this policy would lead to independence and eventually to the colonies surpassing England in her staple industries. Though the statement predates the declaration he'll go on to sign by 11 years, it, of course, proves to be prophetic. A diplomat at heart, Reed hoped for reconciliation and voted against the initial motion for independence. However, he finally signed the Declaration of Independence when he concluded there was no hope for reconciliation with the Crown, and from that point on was a constant supporter of measures taken on behalf of the cause. After the signing, Reed introduced a resolution to Congress which read, "That anyone who shall willfully break this agreement shall have his name published in the public newspapers as a betrayer of the civil rights of America, and forever be deemed infamous and a traitor." During the war, Reed's home was confiscated by the enemy. His wife was taken captive, and he had to go from place to place to avoid capture for some 6 years. In 1786, he was a delegate to the convention which met in Annapolis, Maryland, and later attended the Constitutional Convention in 87. He was a leader in the fight for a strong central government, advocating at one time the abolition of the states altogether and the consolidation of the country under one powerful national government, though nobody seconded the motion. Fearing unequal treatment in the new government, he threatened to lead the Delaware delegation out of the convention if the rights of the small states were not specifically guaranteed in the new Constitution. And his fighting for this representation encouraged Delaware to become the first state to ratify when the new Constitution was finalized. Immediately after this ratification, he was elected to the Senate of the United States, where he served until 1793, resigning to accept the office of Chief Justice of Delaware, which he fills until his death on September 21st. He's buried in the graveyard of Emmanuel Church in Newcastle, and a marble stone succinctly recounts his major accomplishments, saying, "Member of the Congress of the Revolution, the convention that framed the Constitution of the United States, and of the First Senate under it, Judge of Admiralty, President and Chief Justice of Delaware, and a signer of the Declaration of Independence." In September, there's a literary first for the United States as Charles Brockden Brown publishes the first significant American novel, a Gothic fiction called Wyland, or The Transformation, an American Tale, a fiction book set in the period of the Revolutionary War. Speaking of the late war, George Washington is officially appointed the Commander-in-Chief of the Army yet again, and insists on his right to choose the principal officers, including Alexander Hamilton as his second-in-command. However, both men and Adams still hope the army will not be needed. Their prayers are answered on October 1st when Elbridge Gerry arrives back in the States and soon meets with Adams to indicate that Talleyrand is ready to negotiate. Adams accepts the Federalist demand for appointment of a commission rather than a single envoy to conduct further negotiations, and William Vans Murray, Oliver Ellsworth, and William Richardson Davy are selected as commissioners. The crisis that began about a year ago begins to fade, though it'll be some time before the matter is truly put to bed. On October 2nd, the Treaty of Tellico is signed between the United States and the Cherokee Nation. This is the sixth treaty signed with the Cherokees since 1776. There was the Treaty of Hopewell in 85, the Treaty of Holston in 91, the Treaties of Philadelphia and the Tellico Blockhouse in 94, and the second Treaty of Tellico Blockhouse signed last year. In nearly every case, the Cherokee ceded more and more land to the United States through these treaties, and every treaty has been subsequently contested by the Cherokee people as either made under duress, coercion, or by individuals with no right to sign away their land. Despite these complaints, the United States views each treaty as legally binding and permanent, pointing to monetary compensation or the promise of a cessation of hostilities as the underlying reason for the treaty, and continues to create settlements further into what was formerly Indian territory. To provide a little bit of foreshadowing for something we'll discuss next year, early in November, a man by the name of George Logan returns to America after an unsanctioned diplomatic mission to France. Now, as I mentioned, the seed has been planted in American politics for a deep division in the attitude toward federal versus state power. Perhaps it's more apt to say that the seed has been planted ever since the Articles of Confederation, but is only now bearing fruit. First in Kentucky, then soon after in Virginia, resolutions are adopted that are written by Vice President Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, respectively, though anonymously, which, to put it concisely, claim that the Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional and ought to be ignored, as they extend beyond the power granted to the government, specifically in their criminalizing of the public criticizing of the president and/or Congress. Already, dozens of people have been prosecuted under the Sedition Act, with prosecution targeting newspaper editors who favor the up-and-coming Democratic-Republican Party, Jefferson's party. In these resolutions, Jefferson stops just short of claiming a state can nullify an action they believe is unconstitutional, saying that when the federal government, quote, assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. The courts are not consulted in the matter, as every federal judge is a Federalist, and the Federalists have renewed nationalist popularity in light of the XYZ affair, leading Jefferson and Madison to believe the case would only serve to set a precedent counter to their goals. No states besides Virginia and Kentucky support the resolutions, with 10 states even outright issuing statements of disapproval, often pointing to the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution found in Article 6, which states that the states have no power to block enforcement of federal laws, and that the courts should be relied upon to strike down unconstitutional laws if they do exist. While the sedition law continues to be a point of political contention, the underlying question of constitutionality goes unaddressed by the time of the law's expiration date. And as the crisis with France simmers down, so does enforcement of the law. But the familiar argument of a state's rights at odds with the federal government is one that resurfaces in various forms throughout the rest of our history to different levels and different effects. Well, that is it for 1798. A very interesting year as foreign conflicts and domestic partisanship become increasingly relevant. Check our X today for documents and portraits depicting the times we covered. We even have a video breaking down some details about the USS Constitution, the world's oldest commissioned warship still afloat. If you're enjoying the show, take a moment and share it with somebody that you know. If you are able to on the platform you're listening to this on, go ahead and leave it a review or a comment or a like or any other way you can engage with it to show me that you're enjoying the show. Next time, in 1799, America sees another rebellion over taxes. Another amendment to the Constitution is proposed, and we cover the passing of the most influential man in American history. This has been our story, 250 years of the United States of America, and as always, thanks for listening.